At the heart of Zora Neale Hurston's story Sweat are a series of what we would call symbols. And they're critical symbols in the work. And I think it's worth listing them so that we can pay attention to them and see what we gain from understanding them. I mentioned at the first part of this lecture the skillet. The skillet is very interesting because, of course, it's a weapon. It's a weapon, but it's a domestic weapon. It's a weapon that a woman uses. And therefore, it's a weapon of resistance and a feminist weapon of resistance because she's a domestic weapon, a weapon that belongs to her territory and her life. If you contrast that with the other weapons that begin to appear in this work, and the other tools that begin to appear in this work, we get an interesting juxtaposition. So certainly that is one of the symbols. One could also recognize that the washing that Zora Neale Hurston's character Delia does represents something. There's language in it. First of all, Sykes at some point begins to mess up the pristine nature of the washing. Delia's hard work and labor, her industry, her effort takes place around this washing. The washing is also an example of her industry. The washing is also an example of her independence. But the washing is also associated with her connection with white society. So this is something that we're going to come back to. But yet the washing is a turning point for the work because it's at the destruction of the washing and the threat to her ability to make her own living that I think some of the action takes place. Then, of course, we've got the snake. And the snake has a very interesting function because there's the other weapon that I mentioned, which is the whip that Sykes uses. And Sykes was not afraid to threaten Delia with the whip and probably was using the whip. And there's a way in which Delia sort of, in the writing of the story, Zora Neale Hurston associates both the whip with the whip as a kind of weapon and a tool with the snake, which is also sort of shaped in the same way. And Hurston is not unaware of the phallic nature of the snake and the associativeness of the snake with a kind of phallic male construction. Phallic in the sense that it replicates the shape of the male member, the penis. And Delia explores this actually in greater detail as the story progresses, and near the end of the story, there's a moment in which that image becomes even more starkly and quite alarmingly clear. So there's that moment. There are other sort of incidental symbols and metaphors that Zora Neale Hurston would use. Along with the washing, there's the cart and the dray. That is another symbol of progress and success of Delia, industry and hard work. With regards to the men working, the men living in the community, there's this interesting scene in which the men sort of surround themselves about to have this melon feast, this melon eating feast, and yet the melon as a kind of symbol represents a cliche about black people, and in this case, the men get so engrossed in become more interested in eating their melon than taking any action to protect Delia, even though they recognize what Delia has been through. So these are some key images that run throughout. The last image to worth thinking about, there are at least two more that I think are worth thinking about. One is built into the work, which is light, the use of light. In fact, near the end of the story, it is a question of light. Light has a very pragmatic function, and it's the absence of light that leads to the demise of Psyche, and it's the discovery of light that also leads to the freedom, the sort of liberation of Delia. So light becomes a very important thing, and the lantern becomes hugely important. Finally, there's that last image at the end of the work where there's a reference to a tree, a China berry tree that Sykes looks at the end of the work. And it'll be interesting if you can start exploring the etymology of that tree, the sort of the genesis of that tree, the genus of that tree, I probably should say, and how you might imagine that to be. There's a sense in which the distance from from where Sykes is dying, and rescue are far greater than one would imagine. So those are some key symbols, and they're worth sort of thinking about how Zora Neale Hurston uses them throughout the work, because of course this is going to be very important to the construction of the work. Now, one of the things I thought we to think about is how does this narrative unfold, and what is in fact happening with Delia. I ask a very provocative question. Did Is Delia responsible for the death of Sykes? Um, is it an act of murder, or is it, or how else would we read it? And I ask that question because I think Zora Neale Hurston is making a really profound point. And the profound point has to do with the agency of Delia. Because if we think about it, when the story ends, Sykes is dead, which is the intention. Delia knows that Sykes is dead, and Delia has some hand in the death of Sykes. But Delia cannot be implicated legally for the death of Sykes. Delia essentially gets the best situation possible, which is the death of her abusive husband, destructive husband. Not only is he abusive, but he's trying to kill her, so that she manages to see about his end, and at the same time there's no implication on her for doing so. It is the perfect, if you want to call it, crime, or the perfect act of liberation. Now, some people will say that she didn't do anything, but I think Zora Neale Hurston wants to make a bigger point that she has some agency in the death of Sykes, which is what gives it a feminist bent. Because if in fact it's all by chance that Sykes dies, in other words, if it's all just because Sykes killed himself, so to speak, then what we will be left with is a Delia who never really stands up for herself and never actually makes a decision around herself. So one of the interesting things to do is to look very closely at the final um, the final section of the work, right? And I think um, it's worth giving it some consideration, and sort of in some detail, to see whether we can discover something about the motivations and the actions of the characters. Um, I think if we go to near, I just want to read a couple of moments in the work, and that would help us to get to that point. Um, so, as you know, what happens is that there's this conversation initially about the snake. It's a rattlesnake, and everybody learns that Sykes is trapping a rattlesnake, and he manages to trap a massive rattlesnake, a 6-foot rattlesnake. People in the community, including a man called Walter, say to him, "You shouldn't be doing this. It's very dangerous to trap a rattlesnake." But they are amazed at his success in trapping this rattlesnake and getting him in this box, because they thought that the snake was too powerful. And Sykes, of course, says, "You don't know anything about snakes. I'll tell you what about snakes." And he says something really important so that we can understand the way that the plot unfolds. He says the reason that he was able to capture the snake was that the snake was already half asleep and weak for having eaten so many frogs. What Sykes would essentially do is feed the snake. Once the snake had exerted its venom, the snake would then go into a point of hibernation and start to go to sleep. And once the snake starts to sleep, this then puts the snake in a state where it will not attack, it will not do anything. And that's when Sykes would capture it. So Sykes captures the snake, and Sykes puts it in a snake box, and he takes it to the house. He takes it to the house, and unbeknownst to Delia, he brings it to the house. It's a big moment for Delia, because in that moment, when he does bring it to the house, she is angry. she's angry and offended because she knows he knows she hates snakes, and she's told him again and again that she hates snakes, and yet he brings the snake to the house, knowing full well that it's just disturbing to her. And it is at that point that she decides that she doesn't care anymore, and she doesn't see any good point in what was happening. So what do we see happening? Sykes leaves the snake, and the snake is located in a box just outside the door of the house. That's where the snake is supposed to be. And the snake is in that box, in that snake trap, with a mesh around it outside the box of that house. So Delia comes in from her labors in the evening, and she notices that the snake is not making any noises. She thinks the snake is just fast asleep. So she goes into the house, and while she's inside the house, she decides to do her washing. Typically, she would take her washing out into the dining room, and therefore open her laundry basket, take the things out, and start to organize them, and to fold them, and so on and so forth. But for this time, she decides to do it inside the bedroom, and while she's in the bedroom, she discovers that he has put the snake in the laundry basket. And that just frightens her. And she hears the snake starting to go quite aggressive. So she picks up her stuff and she runs out of the place and goes up into the loft of the barn, right? Um, and I mean, here's the description of what happened. She says, I want to cross Jordan in a calm time. She was singing again, the mood of the love feast had returned. She threw back the lid of the basket almost gaily. Then, moved by both horror and terror, she sprang back toward the door. There lay the snake in the basket. He moved sluggishly at first, but even as she turned round and round and round, jumped up and down in an insanity of fear, he began to stir vigorously. She saw him pouring his awful beauty from the basket upon the bed. Then she seized the lamp and ran as fast as she could to the kitchen. The wind from the open door blew out the light, and the darkness added to her terror. So she runs out. There's no more matches in the house. The light in the lantern that she had lit is out. So the place is in darkness. And she runs out of the yard and she goes to the barn. And then we hear these phrases. There for an hour or more she lay sprawled upon the hay, a gibbering wreck. For an hour or more, she's just lying there, a gibbering wreck. Then the next paragraph, finally she grew quiet. And after that, coherent thought. This is massively important. So she's completely afraid, she's speaking gibberish, and then after an hour, she grows quiet. And after that, it says coherent thought. With this stalked through her a cold, bloody rage. This is quite different from fear. So her mood turns into rage, and then there are hours of this, hours of contemplation, and then a period of introspection. This is how it says, and a space of retrospection, then a mixture of both. So first of all, she's looking inside herself to see what kind of person she is and what she's become. And then she looks back into her past and to think of what she has experienced in her path, and then a combination of both. And then out of this, an awful calm. Out of this, an awful calm, the passage says. And then she speaks. She says, well, I done the best I could. If things ain't right, God knows, 'tain't my fault. She says, well, I done the best I could. If things ain't right, I know it ain't my fault. This is a very important moment. Then it says, she went to sleep, a twitch sleep, and woke up to a faint gray sky. There was a loud, hollow sound below. She peered out. Sykes was at the woodpile demolishing a wired-covered box. So he's taken the box, which is what the snake was in, and taken it to the woodpile to destroy it, where it will not be recognized because it would look like just a piece of wood. Why is Sykes doing that? Sykes has decided, he knows therefore that the snake is not in the box. But he always knew the snake was not in the box because he put the snake in the basket. Then it says he hurried to the kitchen door, but hung outside there some minutes before he entered, and stood some minutes more inside before he closed it after him. Now, that means that Zora Neal Hurston is making it clear that there was time, there were minutes, right? She watched him destroy the box. She watched him move back and forth and hesitate and so on. Now, we know that the moment she says, "Hey, Sykes," what would he know? He would know that she was still alive and that she wasn't in the house. He would also know that the snake would be in the house. But at this point, he doesn't know. At this point, what does Sykes think? Actually, we know what Sykes thinks. Sykes thinks that the snake is in the house, but more importantly, that the snake has killed Delia, and therefore the snake is sleeping because he had released the venom. Then here's what we see. The gray in the sky was spreading, meaning it was getting light. Delia descended without fear now. So Sykes has gone in and closed the door after him. Delia descends without fear now and crouched beneath the low bedroom window. So she goes right up to the room. The drawn shade shut out the dawn, shut in the night, but the thin walls held back no sound. And she says, that old scratch is woke up now. She mused at the tremendous whir inside, which every woodsman knows is one of the sound illusions. The rattler is a ventriloquist. His whir sounds to the right, to the left, straight ahead, behind, close underfoot, everywhere but where it is. Woe to him who guesses wrong unless he is prepared to hold up his end of the argument. Sometimes he strikes without rattling at all, and inside Sykes heard nothing until he knocked the pot lid off the stove while trying to reach the match safe in the dark. He had emptied his pockets at Bertha, so he had taken all the matches and he was trying to find light. The snake seemed to wake up under the stove, and Sykes made a quick leap into the bedroom. In spite of the gin he had had, his head was clearing now. My God, he chattered, if I could only struck a light. The rattling ceased for a moment. As he stood paralyzed, he waited. It seemed that the snake waited also. Oh, for the light. I thought he'd be too sick. I thought he'd be too sick. So all this time, Sykes thinks that the snake has attacked Delia and that is too sick to even fight him. Sykes was muttering to himself when the whir began again, closer, right underfoot this time. Long before this, Sykes' ability to think had been flattened down to a primitive instinct, and he leaped onto the bed. Outside, Delia heard a cry that might have come from a maddened chimpanzee, a stricken gorilla. All the terror, all the horror, all the rage that man possibly could express without a recognizable human sound. A tremendous stir inside there, another piece of animal screams, the intermittent whir of the reptile, the shade torn violently down from the window, letting in the red dawn. A huge brown hand seizing the window stick, great dull blows upon the wooden floor, punctuating the gibberish of a sound long after the rattle of the snake had abruptly subsided. All this Delia could see and hear from her place beneath the window, and it made her ill. She crept over to the 4 o'clocks and stretched herself on the cool earth to recover. She lay there. Delia, Delia, she could hear Sykes calling in a moused, despairing tone, as one who expected no answer. The sun crept on up, and he called. Delia could not move. Her legs were gone flabby. She never moved. He called, and the sun kept rising. My God, she heard him moan. My God, From heaven she heard him stumbling about and got up from her flower bed. The sun was growing warm. As she approached the door, she heard him call out hopefully, "Dahlia, is that you are here?" She saw him on his hands and knees as soon as she reached the door. He crept an inch or two toward her, all that he was able, and she saw his horribly swollen neck and his one open eye shining with hope. A surge of pity too strong to support bore her away from that eye that could not fail to see the tubs. He could see the lamp. Orlando with its doctors was too far. She could scarcely reach the chinaberry tree where they waited in the growing heat, while inside she knew the cold river was creeping up and up to extinguish that eye which must know by now that she knew. So this is how it ends. So the question then becomes, Delia, of course, recognizes all the elements we see here is that Sykes then it dawns on him, Delia is still alive. If Delia is like, that's how he come, he's dying. Delia knew this was going to happen. Or Delia knew that all she had to do was make a sound while she was up in the barn. And Sykes wouldn't go into the house. Yet it is Sykes who has set up his own death. Absolutely. Sykes who brought the weapon. Sykes created the means. And Delia's action is an inaction. But it is a forceful feminist action of inaction that leads to the death of Sykes. It's a fascinatingly written story. And it's important to Zora Neal Hurston that Sykes knows. That's the thing that Sykes knew. She says she realized that he, by any stretch, would have known that he knew two things. One, that she knew he was trying to kill her. And two, that she therefore, by not alerting him, was responsible for him dying. In other words, she had enacted her revenge. It's a very fascinating story. So that's the eyes, sweat. A very interesting and very sophisticated way of thinking about it. So let's think about it as a work of feminist action. The action is in this moment of introspection, retrospection, and a calm, quiet ease. She says, whatever happens is whatever happens. That is a cool kind of articulation. And it's an articulation that then leads to the demise of Sykes. Nobody reading the work is going to feel sorry for Sykes. Yet in many ways, Sykes has brought his own comeuppance. The demon, the devil, Old Scratch, has destroyed him. Interesting thing. Good to think about some of the topics and the ideas that are there and to think about how feminism and gender is operating in this work. These are some of the comments and thoughts that you can make. So that's it. Zora Neal Hurston's Sweat.